Hi, I'm Adrian Rue, and this is Toolbox, a resource for local preachers, worship leaders and small group leaders. Today we're looking at the passage in Mark chapter 5, verses 21 to 43. In Palestine in Jesus' day, everyone had their rightful place in society, which was defined by their wealth, their power, their gender and their status. And they called it honor. And honor determined your place within society, determined to whom you could speak and how you could speak and how you interacted with people, what you were allowed to do and how you could interact. It really much determined your prospects in society. It regulated social roles and transactions, and it controlled movement within the system. Now, rightly or wrongly, I think we'll find that the same is true today. We imagine that everyone has a rightful place in society that is defined by things like status, wealth, their access to power. And though honor culture is still very prevalent in some places, we don't always notice it. And if we don't notice it, we won't easily realize the horror and shock of Jesus stopping and talking to a woman when Jairus has made a call on him. The passage as we see it seems to have two parts, Jairus' daughter and the woman who's been bleeding for 12 years. But the episode is really an example of the sandwich construction which Mark uses when he wants us to compel us to compare two parts of a story and to relate the two to each other. So the story begins in verse 21 when Jesus returns to Jewish territory. And he's approached by a member of the Jewish ruling class. Now Jairus is the head both of his family, appealing on behalf of his daughter, and of his social group, his leader of the synagogue. And his approach is all frontal and correct, an assertive approach to Jesus, such as befits social male equals. But he acknowledges Jesus' honor. He lowers himself before him, as a grant of honor, before he makes his favor known. He asks, in his sense, what turns out to be a favor on behalf of his daughter. And Jesus agrees to go and heal her. But he's interrupted en route by the advances of some nameless, unclean woman who steps out of the crowds. And the woman's approach to Jesus is in stark contrast to that of Jairus. She reaches out anonymously, from behind, in the crowd, and she's actually only seeking to touch Jesus covertly and see if that somehow effects a cure. This woman talks only to herself, verse 28. And she's nameless, and she's alone, and she's statusless, and unlike Jairus' daughter, she doesn't have anyone to defend her within society. The two main characters are archetypical opposites in terms of economic status and honor. They represent the opposite ends of the social strata. And so the disciples discourage Jesus from trying to discover and interact with her. And it becomes obvious that she's in bad shape. She's bled for 12 years. She's suffered under many doctors. She's spent all her money. And instead of benefiting from that, she's grown worse. Worse still, according to the Levitical law, she would have been perpetually unclean and segregated both from society and from God. The purity code mandated in Leviticus 15 verse 19 that it was appropriate for a hemorrhaging woman to not be in public. But come verses 29 and 30, the physical healing is emphasized. It's repeated. She was healed physically. And yet it's interesting that Mark tells us that power has been transferred. That's what verse 30. Not the emphasis on the healing, but that power has been transformed. And so has this been not just a physical, material healing, but the empowerment of the oppressed or the liberation of someone? Is she now able to stand on her own and to take her rightful place within society? The purity code is very much at issue. Jesus touches this unclean woman. And the expectation would have been that her sinfulness or her uncleanness would have infected Jesus. But instead, it turns out that holiness is the infectious thing. Holiness, not sinfulness, is the thing that we catch. From the bottom of the honor scale, this doubly poor woman intrudes upon the important mission on behalf of someone who's right at the top of the honor scale. But by the conclusion of the story, it is this woman who falls on her feet falls at Jesus' feet. Verse 33. She belongs, having become the daughter at the center of the story. My daughter, your faith has saved you, Jesus says, and places her above the status of the disciples who, in 4 verse 40, still had no faith. But the delay causes Jairus' daughter to die. And yet, even when they get the message, Jesus is undeterred. He ignores that and he says to Jairus, do not fear, only believe. That's verse 36. He's instructing the leader of the synagogue to learn about faith from the outcast woman. When they get to Jairus' household, the morning turns to derision when Jesus insists that the girl is only sleeping. It's as if they're saying, we know what dead looks like. But so often, being asleep is a symbol for a lack of faith. You can see that in 13 verse 36 and 14 verse 32. And so Jesus throws out the onlookers and raises the girl back to life. And listen, verse 42, the witnesses are beside themselves with great astonishment. That kind of reaction only happens at one other place in Mark's Gospel, at Jesus' resurrection, 16 verse 8. Mark has shaped the story carefully to put the two extremes of the Jewish social position next to each other. And in the art of narrative, there's very good reason for every detail. And the one detail that we mustn't miss is that the young girl is 12 years old and that the nameless woman has been bleeding for 12 years. To Jewish thought, the number 12 would always bring to mind the nation of Israel. And so there is a way that Mark is portraying this narrative to help us realize that both of these people represent the nation of Israel. Here is the greatest and the best and the most popular of the nation of Israel, and here is the underside and what we're not supposed to see of the nation of Israel. Within the family of Israel, these daughters represent both the privileged and the impoverished. And because of such inequity, the body politic of the synagogue and of Israel is at the point of death. The healing journey, however, doesn't just come easily. The healing journey takes a necessary detour that stops to listen to the pain of the people, that stops to listen to the pain of the crowd. And only when the outcast woman has been restored to true daughterhood can the daughter of the synagogue be restored to true life. That is the faith the privileged have to learn from the poor. And so the story shows us a characteristic of the sovereignty of God that Jesus will later address. The last will be first and the least will be greatest. Look at 10 verse 31 and 43. Perhaps in our society today, Mark paints a very clear picture for us too, that only when the poor stop bleeding can the rich find life. If the rich are to find life, if the rich are to be raised to life, the poor must first stop bleeding. We must stop bleeding them dry.